Got some Advil?
Yeah, I took some. I took some already. It happened a few hours ago.
Okay. Yeah,
I thought
just a dead branch out of the tree or something?
no, it was alive. It had been broken off before, and then the tree moved a little bit, and it got kind of flung back from up pretty high. You got to be really careful at tree branches falling. But that's if I wasn't wearing a hard hat, I would have been in a world of hurt. Like, I mean, it knocked my hat off.
Good that you were.
Yeah.
So
but
hey, John and anybody else who, after the fact, wants to join us during these musings, here we are in the Resurrecting Civility podcast, an open topic session, and of course, we all know what we probably want to talk about. There's lots going on, lots to talk about.
Yeah.
You guys, I'm sure, have been listening in and following and noticed about 1,000 interesting things. Anybody care to drop some pieces on the table to start with?
Well, today I saw James Mattis wrote an article criticizing the president, which I thought was really interesting because he is a favorite of conservatives, it seems to me. So a very outspoken criticism of the president from him should carry a lot of weight. Or probably does.
Yeah, a lot of weight among military members, you mean, especially?
Yeah, definitely, especially them. Yeah.
And he was the Secretary of Defense for a little while. Is that right?
He was.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then quit over differences of opinion, I think.
Yeah.
That's right. Had to do with, if I remember correctly, there was some action taken, some significant administrative action taken in a military matter for which he wasn't even in the loop.
Oh, was that the Syria thing?
I thought it was before the Kurds, before we abandoned the Kurds. But
Right.
Lots of stuff happened.
Yeah. He sure was. He sure has almost a cult following in the military. People thought very highly of him. I know a number of those people, and so do you.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting article to read. What was the? I mean, and what did he criticize the president on specifically?
Basically, for during a moment of national unrest, being a figure of divisiveness rather than unity. And I mean, he says not even just now, but like for his whole presidency, he's been divisive rather than a unifier.
Yeah.
Which, the other thing I just did recently is I just watched the Waco Netflix series.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Which I thought was pretty interesting and also pretty good. But like, it was kind of interesting because a huge like main theme of the show is the increasing militarization of the FBI and police and stuff, and how the main character is trying to fight against that, basically. So I think that has a lot of relationship with a lot of the discussions going on now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although it seems to me that I don't know how much militarization. I don't know. It seems to me the militarization of the police has sort of been a separate issue compared to what we've been seeing. I mean,
also linked with just like the willingness to use force and go up to like the next level, I think is encompassed in that. But.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
so before we unite them, how would you break them down, JP? Different.
How would I break down what?
Maybe there's a couple of different issues. There's the militarization of, say, the FBI or even of the police on one hand, but I think you were suggesting that there's some other issues as well. And then John Rose quickly reunited those as not unrelated, at least, to one another.
Yeah.
So, but how would you, what might we distinguish before we ask about how they're related? Militarization on one hand and what?
I guess what the current discussion on how to reform the police is about.
I think I just lagged out for a second, you guys.
Yeah. John, JP, any chance you're blessed with a concussion?
I don't think so. No, I think my phone just froze. Both you guys just froze on my screen.
Oh, I get it. It wasn't you that lagged out.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
You got to ask when there's a head injury, you know?
Yeah. No, yeah.
Soccer coach.
Yeah. I appreciate it. But you were asking how I would break down the issues?
Yeah.
Well, I think it seems to me the main sort of talking points are just systemic racism on the part of as it regards police brutality specifically, but also escalating into just America in general. I think you see that as in a lot of the protesting going on. That's one element of it. And then you have the rioting and looting going on alongside the protests, and a loss of law and order in a lot of major cities where police basically, it seems like police aren't really doing their jobs in some ways. I mean, like, was it yesterday or the day before? I mean, there's just pretty rampant looting going on in the cities and people's businesses being destroyed. And so those are sort of the major one side of the spectrum is focusing on the police brutality and systemic racism and things not being done on that front. And then the other side is how is all this looting and rioting being allowed to take place night after night? Like, why isn't that being stopped? And just people being outraged. Like, I was listening to Ben Shapiro's podcast today, and I listened to a few episodes, most of which were almost exactly the same. But basically, he was just all worked up about the fact that people are being forced to be under curfew because of looters and rioters, and that it was the responsibility of a primary government responsibility is to protect the property and freedom of the lives and property of its citizens. And these cities are just sort of throwing up their hands and letting looting and riots go on. And he talked about some disturbing interactions between looters and shop owners. You know, there's a couple pretty big ones in Dallas and then in Rochester, New York. I think it was the other big one with a older woman.
I missed that one.
And so that's going on, and then you have people like, George Floyd's family sort of calling for the looting and rioting to stop. And so you have a lot of people calling for middle ground, and calling for, protests to be done in the right way. And then sort of this specter hanging over the whole thing, stoking the flames of our president, just with the whole photo op debacle, sort of fanning the flames, and with his pretty despicably divisive tweeting he's been doing. So I think those are sort of the three big things going on. There's, one side is there isn't systemic racism and looters and rioters need to be stopped immediately. And then the other side is there's systemic racism at all levels of our society. That's sort of the other pole. And then there's people who have sort of an idea about how to move forward, and how to, what sort of policies might be taken. Anyway, that's sort of my view from what I've read the past couple days. So
Gotcha.
few different issues, I guess.
JR, what are your thoughts?
Do you have a working difference in the definitions of systemic racism and institutional racism? I think I kind of know, but I don't know exactly where they.
I haven't been using them as different things. Okay, is there a difference? Yeah.
I'm sure.
I always thought of institutional racism as more like actual laws, like redlining and stuff like that. And systemic racism is kind of more broad, I guess. Right. It doesn't really have a specific.
So it's a genus and species relationship, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
But I don't know if that's correct or not.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, you'd be using institutions in a broader than normal sense if you talked about, say, neighborhood rudeness or something like that, right? That's not exactly an institution. A neighborhood isn't, but it could very well be systemic. Could.
Yeah. So one thing that I've been kind of thinking about with this is the U.S. police force like a uniquely bad institution or uniquely rotten, or like if systemic racism permeates everything, is the police force even more rotten than everything else? Or is it just the police are just not very good at doing their job, kind of, which encompasses a lot of different things, and then and then systemic racism is just the reason that we see stuff like this more often?
That's a good question.
So I think the claim by a lot of people was that the police force is uniquely rotten. And I'm not 100% certain on what the claims are behind that. But that's just something that I've been thinking about.
There are lots of police forces. I think I heard, what was the name, the number I heard today?
18,000 is what I heard.
Yeah, that's the numbers, or high 17s was the number I was just reaching for. And maybe I heard that in former President Barack Obama's remarks during that were widely broadcast this afternoon in a foundation seminar of some sort. And I think the point he was making there was in pointing to those numbers is that reform is really, they say all politics is local, and maybe all police reform is too. Or at least it begins there. And he said that his point was there are very many different colors of problems here, or at least there could be. He wasn't so much enumerating the different types of problems, but he was suggesting that reform has got to begin locally in all kinds of different places. And I presume that's because they're very different. So you could imagine, you could imagine that, John, the answer to your question is yes and yes, and maybe no and no also, right? Just
Yeah.
There's so many different ways, different facets of the answer to either of those questions. But I also think it's useful to step back and say, well, yeah, that's right. I mean, there's always going to be, you're breaking it down to individual manifestations of various kinds of problems, but you can still wonder whether there's some common currents that are running across. You could ask whether, all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You might wonder whether power corrupts police departments particularly. For example, I'm not asserting that at the moment, although I wonder if I think it's true. I suppose I do. But my point is not that it's true. My point is somebody might think it is, right? And if it were, it might hit police departments worse in some way. That they sort of practice power on a regular basis, at least in some kinds of policing contexts.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe every kind of policing context to some extent, and some kinds of policing contexts to a very regular, boom, boom, boom pattern of life extent. You're exercising power, and maybe there's a corrupted, maybe there are vices that show up around that and that you would expect to grow.
Do you guys have any statistics at your fingertips for sort of illustrating the problem in a measurable way? The institutional racism as it relates to policing.
I mean, just like the number of African Americans killed versus white people every year, or
or some
I think it's
some indicative statistic.
How about incarceration rates?
Yeah.
What you might get at there is whether all people are treated equally by the police. And there you'd have to dig. I mean, it's not an obvious. It's a complex situation, and there would be no single factor that's going to just turn the lights on for you. You'd have to dig deep into correlations, et cetera.
Yeah.
But and it's a good question. I wonder whether you think that statistics is just going to do it for you. What I mean by that is, let's see if I can say it real briefly, or else I probably shouldn't say it. There are some kind of problems you might be able to fix by a certain limited dive into the data. There's sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end to your dive. And there are statistical tools that you could marshal and you can tease out certain relationships that seem to be there in the data. But there are other kinds of things where you run into sort of chicken or the egg problems that the data just doesn't give you an answer to. So what's the relationship between poverty and racism?
Right.
For example, right? And then what's the correlation between poverty and crime?
Yeah.
And between race and crime? And I don't know, just to take that example, whether you can just fix that by having a good chief data scientist, something like that, you know?
Yeah. You think it would have been that answer would be obvious if it were, right? I mean, someone would have done this.
Maybe. I don't know. There's disagreements about all kinds of things that data scientists can do. I mean, imagine we looked at data around global warming, for example.
Yeah.
Right. And there's another area in which it's not just idiots that challenge the assumptions that go behind, that are behind and that are motivating, that are sort of in the background of various treatments of data, even sophisticated treatments of lots of data that are done with a lot of care. There may still be assumptions in the gathering of that data and of what's relevant and what's not. There's various theoretical models that are laden in the approach that you're taking. And maybe that's the way it is in terms of thinking about human beings too.
Yeah.
They're as complicated as the climate, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like listening and reading the conservative response to this. I mean, a lot of it is just an outright denial of the problem. Like, this problem is manufactured by the narrative, sort of what's the project that the New York Times did, the
1619 maybe, the first year of first slave ship arriving in the United States.
The 1619 project. It's just the 1619 project lens on our history, and sort of treating it as if things haven't improved, and I'm trying to remember the exact statistics that people use, but something like black people are actually less likely to be shot when involved in violent crime than white people are. That's a stat that people throw out. Like, so African Americans there are much more violent crimes committed by African Americans, but they're less likely to be shot than a white person is committing.
Shot by whom?
The police.
Particularly.
Yeah. Sorry, that should have made that clear. And so it's all just washed into this, well, African Americans are the ones committing the crimes, so they're the ones getting the most police attention. And so that's the narrative that I hear on the conservative side. And it's they're very much like, these are the statistics, these are the people committing the crimes, they're the ones getting sent to jail. It's like, of course this is the reason things look the way they do. And so they sort of wash it into from my view, it seems like they're just washing it into the poverty bucket, basically. Like, yeah, they're poor and they're committing crimes and the police are hard on them.
Right.
But they're still responsible for the behavior.
Sure.
That's what I hear from.
Yeah.
That's really the conservative lens. it seems to me. And so the reason I asked the statistics question is like, it seems like it'd be really helpful to be like, this is a significant number that sort of throws a wrench in that narrative, you know, for someone who isn't willing to accept, and maybe it's just, there's no talking to, maybe this conversation is impossible if someone rejects the idea that there is still a problem with racism in this country. Right? If you don't accept that, then what the protesters are saying doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah. Have you heard anybody in the current debates in any circles deny that there is racism that's still present in the United States? I mean, that would be a pretty extreme position in a way, right? No, we got rid of all of it. There's zero.
I think the claim is that it's not a significant factor in people's lives, I think.
Yeah. I think that's more accurate.
Right.
Yeah. It's not embedded in our institutions. It's a fringe phenomena that doesn't really affect people anymore. You have your racist nut jobs in the backwoods, but I don't know what they say.
You mean you can imagine there are sort of real racists, or at least vocal racists.
Right.
That's precisely what I meant, who are on the side of racism. That is, they think racism, their policies are racist, and they would tell you flat out that's so.
Yeah.
Right. They justify it. And that's who you were referring to as sort of the nut jobs in the backwoods.
Yeah.
Of Osceola, Indiana. Oops, maybe I should have said that out. And by the way, I don't even know if it's true anymore. I just know that I think the KKK might have originated in Osceola, Indiana.
Oh,
that's why I said that.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting. And if I got it wrong, then I apologize to Osceola. And I only meant that in terms of a historical point that happens to be near me. And I think it is actually true. But I've heard it repeated. Maybe it's falsely a bunch of times. I don't know. Yeah, there's those folks. And then there's also a lot of people for whom racism isn't a thing because they don't. Well, I was once in a dinner table conversation in which one member of my family asked another member of my family, "Do you know any black people?" And it was kind of a disruptive question. And the answer is the exception proves the rule that no. I think. So there are a lot of places where people just don't cross racial lines in their ordinary pattern of life. And they probably don't see a lot of racism either.
Yeah.
And they're more likely to think that they're not racist. And they might be right that they're not, right? On the other hand, they might not be. It depends on how they think they got in this relatively. Depends on what else they know and who else they know. But we've kind of already got at who else they know. And if they don't know very many people in other ways, walks of life, it's a fair question what else they know. Because there might be some things, it's a good question as to whether there's some things that you just got to live with people in order to know.
Yeah.
But that's a disputable point, and people could dispute it. You could say, no, you read books, you watch movies, you listen to, you hear all kinds of people on TV, right? So you hear lots and lots of perspectives. And that is certainly more so these days than it used to be. No question. Yeah. On the other hand, you might wonder if you've never cried at somebody's funeral with people from another point of view, people who are very different than you. You know, how well do you know them? Because you saw some. Anyway. Racism.
Yeah. So what is the bigger topic we're talking about here?
Well, we're throwing a lot of things on the table, all surrounding current events, and whether racism is alive and well is certainly one of those issues. Whether it's reflected in whether there is racial injustice reflected in policing, reflected in other dimensions of maybe other institutions, to talk about institutional racism, maybe in the courts, maybe in the law in the first place. Those are places you could look.
So if there's like a scale of the 2 points of view that racism permeates every aspect of our society at one side, and racism is not a significant thing in almost anybody's lives, how do you go about doing your best to determine I don't know what America is really like? Or I mean, I guess it can be different for every person, but what do we act like? How do you go about actually discovering that, if there is something to discover that says something true about America?
Pretty wide extremes.
Right. Yeah. That was just the scale. I mean, it's somewhere in between those two.
Yeah. So you're asking how do you discover in a given place, to make some more distinctions, where on that spectrum things might actually lie?
Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
And from whose point of view? I wonder if you can drop that another set of cross-cutting distinctions that wash across different places, different degrees, and different perspectives. Yet another one. Is there, I mean, do we think that there's only one perspective on this matter? Is there just sort of the right thinking perspective?
Yeah, so that's my question. Is it even possible to come to a conclusion? Because I mean, it seems a lot of people have, but people can live entirely different experiences depending on who and where they are. But I mean, tons of people make this claim. So if we are going to make a claim about how racist or what type of reform needs to be made in the United States or police, you do kind of need to think about it on that scale, it seems to me, or try to come up with a conclusion.
In different regions, perhaps differently, right? Acknowledging that.
So you would just break it down?
Well, I think one would, I wouldn't say just break it down, but I would say you have to break it down. If there is racism in federal law, if there's racism in our national ideals, if there's an echo of, well, have you been to Philadelphia? Have you seen the Liberty Bell by any chance? It's a great place to go. Go if you possibly can to Philadelphia and tour, Independence Hall. Walk in where they signed the Declaration. It's in beautiful living memory as an institution, as a structure, etc. And it's a beautiful place to go. It's actually pretty stunning. And I don't know why it doesn't get more press than it does. Or more. It took us, we actually had to go there to find that out. have we been evangelists for it ever since. But in that city hangs the Liberty Bell, and across the park from the Liberty Bell, and by the way, you know, the Liberty Bell is famously cracked, and we'll come back to it in a second. But George Washington's first residence was there. I shouldn't say it's his first residence. I think maybe it was his home while he was president, or for a while. I forget the details. Certainly the White House emerged a little bit later than the presidency did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't prepare the White House during the Revolutionary War, and George moved into it. President Washington moved into it when it was done. So, and as I think you know, the seat of government was moved at some point, right? Some very early, precisely the years, to D.C. from Philadelphia. So it started in Philadelphia, and uncovered in the ruins of Washington's house are the slave quarters down underneath, in some measure. There may be covered to the elements, but my recollection is they're also in some way open, so that you don't have to sort of walk in. You can look down and see. You know, maybe there's a like a covered something, a covered overhang, and maybe there's some plexiglass up on the side, something like that. But you can look down; it's pretty accessible, and it's right across the street from the Liberty Bell. And the and then you hear while you're there that the Liberty Bell was a recognized symbol of racial what's the word? Well, of civil rights, really. But this is far private to what we would call the civil rights movement. And that the crack in the Liberty Bell has a history also, and I don't just mean a metallurgical history. It's got an analogical history. It's got a story to it. And I'll just cut to the chase and tell you the story I took away from learning all of those things, which is that the crack in the Liberty Bell actually does symbolize racism. It's the crack in our own structural foundations in the United States. I mean, we entered into this theoretical description, right, of we hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera, but we meant it only so much. There were people around who knew that that wasn't quite right, but they didn't think that they could pull together the whole if they couldn't bring the right segments of society together, sufficiently powerful segments of society together, if they insisted on the abolition of liberty and that interpretation. And so they didn't. That was in some people's minds. Whether women's suffrage was in anybody's mind is another question. So perhaps yet another crack. But so that's what I mean by that raises the question symbolically of the possibility of institutional racism that runs right through our very history. The very way we crafted the document that we say we believe Americans might have written into them compromise. And one might go so far as to say compromise with evil, right? Selling short the very ideals that they expressed. And that would be cross. And that's why I wouldn't say we just did. But I certainly think there's a difference between, and I won't name any localities, but there are difference between various localities that had different parts of the battle for the restoration or a fuller awareness of human rights have played out in different places.
Yeah.
So institutionalized racism was written into our founding documents? Is that?
I'm certainly asking that question. I certainly gave, what I started addressing was whether you can just look locally. And I said, no, you don't have to just look locally, but you really have to look locally. That was the response I was giving. And I was saying that I was using this, it was a long-winded version, for a long-winded way of saying, maybe it's the case that you could have national institutionalized racism and not just and national across all of time with respect to the United States. From our very founding, you could imagine that you could raise the question. People raised the question at the time. People have raised the question ever since. Right? And it seems to me, not without good reason, people have raised the question as to whether we've been founded really wrongly. I mean, our whole system of national banks, et cetera, who had money and who didn't? Where'd that money come from? Right? What was the role of slavery in the acquisition and distribution of wealth in the United States? And then what did we do with it? We preserved it. We set up laws to make sure that the people who had it held on to it in various measures, right? And we made compromises, political compromises, to share some measure of that wealth for certain kinds of common goals. Where common are defined by the people who had wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think what's wrong with that system? Right? What could go wrong for the oppressed?
Mm-hmm. It seems like in those, I think to me, institutional racism typically means something you can actually point to, like a law or an instance, or like a clear one that's not explicitly racist, but like longer prison sentences for crack cocaine over the powder form. So that, I think you can point to as like, that's institutional racism. I get a bit more curious or question it a bit more when we get so broad that we're not pointing to things anymore. Because how do you solve that?
It is true that when you just tell stories and you stay vague, you're not pointing to anything you can solve. I sure take your point there.
But systemic racism for me is that's still alive and well. I think all of our systems over the years were corrupted by these influences and has resulted on keeping African Americans on the bottom rung of the economic ladder, which has done immeasurable harm and continues to do so. But
yeah, I wonder if it's.
I mean, and
I understand the word you use, but I think it's worth asking whether you can measure it. I have heard some attempts to measure it, and I don't have any, as JP said, at my fingertips, any statistics. I don't. But something like you could track. You could track what? Basically, suppose you tracked household wealth, however that's net worth, household net worth, historically by race and across places, and just watch it grow. My guess is you probably could do that, and you could probably measure a lot that way. And I think people have done that, right? So if there were promises after a war, for example, to provide land to soldiers who fought it, and then those promises were not kept, right? in part on some racial, with some racial inequalities involved in the failure to keep them. If that were the case, you could probably track the implications of that, right, on the descendants of people for whom the promise might have been fulfilled but wasn't. My guess is that is something you could average over that, right? You could get numbers.
Yeah, I think people have.
Yeah. And I think that the place to look for those numbers is in the restitution discussion. That's one place where you hear those numbers. People will say, hey, it's not enough, right? To say, hey, look, you can compete for the same job I can, buddy. Gee, I'm sorry your schooling wasn't as good in your neighborhood, but I can't fix all the problems, and I didn't make your school but disadvantaged. And to be honest, you could have fixed that with effort, and that's one take, right, on the reparations. That maybe a caricature of a take on reparations. But somebody else might want to reach back precisely into those statistics and talk about the neighborhood you came and the average net worth of the families in that neighborhood and the average in the tax base, right? And the whole conglomerate of problems in which the school is weighed down to solve. We just had a referendum in South Bend, the Vote Yes referendum. And there were folks who didn't like that. Happily, I believe it passed, happily from my point of view. But other decent human beings wanted, thought the schools are run poorly and shouldn't be given more money. And they look at outcomes and versus inputs, and they say this is a broken system here. But what in that kind of conversation, what you have to do is you have to articulate what all the problems are that are being solved or being addressed, and funds are used to address that are inside that box. Right? What are the pressures on the system, on the school system? And the last thing I'll say about this is I met a guy in Baltimore. I met a guy from Baltimore on a retreat, and he works for a system that addresses particularly the challenges for young African American men. It's not a My Brother's Keeper program, but it's like that, which focuses on that same population. And they have a 12-to-1. Let me get this right. The ratio is 12-to-1, and it's a ratio involving people who provide assistance to the young men who receive this assistance. And you might think, when I first heard that, I thought, I get it. It's you got one mentor, and who takes care of 12 young men, right? And the answer is no, that's not how it works. It's the opposite. You have 12 mentors for one young man, because what they're trying to do is replace the pieces in that young man's life who are not there in other people's lives. And that's what that particular program identified as sort of an algorithm, to use that language again, for affecting change. So that's just a story. It's a real story from a real program, but that's the sort of thing that people point to. And when they talk about the whole range of problems, whether it's a school system trying to solve them now, or whether we're talking about how those problems grew up historically in the communities in the first place, right? And poverty is part of that story. Unequal treatment under the law is part of that story. Family disruption based upon policies of incarceration is part of that story, and there's probably other parts of that story too, but that's a good start.
So would you is there a specific type of or form of reparations that you would be interested in for moving forward, or?
I don't know enough about it. I think it's a really complicated topic, and I've put some time into understanding it, but not nearly enough. So I don't even know what the best proposals out there are. I don't even know the whole range of proposals out there.
Yeah.
So, never mind, does anybody have any data? Does anybody have a good argument, et cetera? What's the rationale behind them? I'd say I just looked at it enough to get a feel for what the problem is, just a feel, an outsider's feel for what the problem is that's trying to be addressed in the discussion, which I think is a good start, but not nearly far enough.
So I think also another part of the discussion is just poverty in general. And I don't know if it's like the level that people experience racism or disadvantage from minority status. How does that play into being entitled to a greater percentage of help, basically, than other poor kids of any other race? I mean, so affirmative action, I guess, would be. Yeah, so I don't have any super strong opinions on it, but I think that is another part of the discussion.
Yeah. Well, I told you that story about South Bend a little while ago, a week or two back, an episode or two back, a discussion or two ago, where somebody had to sit up in his house, his newly acquired house, on the wrong side of town with a shotgun on his lap, right? Because somebody had sold a house to somebody in the wrong place of the wrong color. And that story came from one of the young men who worked on that project. And this was just a construction project. It was just a real estate deal. It wasn't when I say it's a project, it was not a housing project. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't, although I don't know, maybe the guy had his eyes open and was going to do it in spite of some anticipated blowback. But our conversation was not about the purposes of the person who moved the house. It was about what happened to him after he did. And that is, he basically nobody would do business with him again. So my point is, if you lived in that environment, it would be more complicated than just poverty, because you might fix a lot of things that have to do with poverty, but if somebody's not going to let you live in a certain neighborhood because of your color, that's not just a poverty issue. You can't just fix that with a different education. As a matter of fact, this person was a medical doctor who was sitting with a shotgun on his lap.
Mm-hmm.
Right. How long ago was this? And how often does stuff like this happen now?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question. How long ago it was, I can give you an estimate. It was in the 70s, because the person telling me was talking to me about his experience with this project as a young man in the labor force.
Yeah.
And he's my age roughly. Might be a little younger, so it might be a little more recently than the 70s.
Right. That's what I thought. I mean, I just.
70s.
It
seems like a long time ago.
I mean, that is a long time ago.
Yeah, not for me, it isn't.
I mean, that's
for me, it seems like yesterday.
But also just in terms of where our attitudes in our country. I mean,
that's what we thought in the 70s, John. That's exactly what I thought when I was that age. I mean, we had just celebrated the bicentennial of the United States. That's 200 years old. right? And we were we were all aglow, right, with thoughts about the successes and the progress that had been made. Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. He wasn't a racist, right? Et cetera. And we thought racism was the exception. We sort of grew up thinking that. And yet, according to this story, it wasn't the exception here, it was the rule. So I'm saying, from my point of view, as somebody who's watched them since then till now, I'm not saying that there's been no progress anywhere. That would be, of course, wrong. And I'm not even saying that there hasn't been general progress in a good direction. The election of Barack Obama, I think, sure felt like progress that reverberated through the nation. But yeah.
I mean, but look at how everyone has responded to. Look at how everyone's responded to this killing.
That's right.
Right? I mean, it has been universally decried. I mean, they were fired. The guy's going to jail. Like, no one, everyone, it seems like everyone's on the same page about this guy.
Well, just to update it, of course, now 4 of them are being charged as 3 as accessories and 1 with second-degree murder. If I understood the new charges, it just came out late this afternoon.
I mean, that seems like justice to me. And you compare that to what was going on in the 90s. I mean, compare that to Rodney King, right?
I agree.
Right. I mean, that's a huge difference.
Sure, but
so the response is, look what it took to get them in jail, I think.
I mean, as far as what it took to get them in jail, what it took was a video camera.
Oh, you don't think it took a video camera and demonstrations in 40 cities across the United States? Whatever the number is.
Certainly think the demonstrations made a big difference. Yeah, but I mean, I think once that video got out, they were going to be charged.
Well, that was false initially for 3 of them, right? I mean, a first set of charges came down before they handed it off to the state attorney general. I think the other attorney general, and I have nothing against him or for him or her, I don't know who that person is, but thought of charges differently.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I point to it is it's progress.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think here's some statistics I'm going to have to make up, but I'm making them up not just at the margins of my memory. Okay, and I heard them just this afternoon in a Fox News broadcast. Let me retract that, because it's not impossible that I watched several things. So it's possible that I'm conflating the source. But the statistics went like this. It had to do with the change in how many persons, generally across the United States and broken down by race, think that, and I wish I could remember the wording of the particular polling question, but it's something like this, that African Americans are treated worse by police than, but it may not have been African American focused. It might have been people of color. I forget exactly how it was phrased. Okay, but it was something like that. And the point that was being made by the commentator is that over the last, and the number of years is like 2 or 3, it was a very small number of years that the person was talking about. Among white people, we went from 24% of them thinking that it's more difficult for African Americans who get arrested to now slightly less than the majority. And the point that was being made is that's a really big swing. That's a huge swing. And I think that that's right. It is a huge swing, but it's a remarkably recent swing. Probably seems, it probably seems further back in time to you than it does to me, because I've had more years, right? So that's further to the end of my temporal spectrum here.
How many? You said
It's
3
also
years.
the case, it's also the case. That's my recollection. Is that it was a very recent change that they were talking about in a matter of a handful of years, right? Probably, my guess is probably since Ferguson, and unless it was further back to, and now I forget the fellow's name who also couldn't breathe, Michael, in New York City.
Yeah.
Right.
Cooper?
No. In any case, his name will pop in our heads, and I'm sorry I don't remember it. But that was what, 5 years ago at most? And the point is, half of more than half of the white people responding to that poll didn't think there was any difference or any appreciable difference or whatever. It was asking for some reasonably worded recognition of the fact that it's tougher to be arrested. You're going to be treated a little bit worse if you're a person of color. We could look at those numbers. They're really available. But that, to me, that says if there's a change that's going to happen, it's mostly still on the other side. We're still in the old regime. I mean, that's sort of like, that's the kind of polls I saw about whether homosexuals ought to be allowed to marry other people, to get married to one another. About
in 2008. Yeah.
Between 2008 and 2012, there was a large transformation.
Right.
And maybe even after that.
Right.
So,
but isn't that, but so what, I guess my question is, I mean, there is significant progress being made, right?
Yes.
And the gay marriage thing is a significant indicator of progress, and progress happening quickly, right? Over relatively short time spans.
Well, it looks like that. Depends on when you start the clock, right?
But even 50 years, right? I mean, that's not that long. I mean,
well,
relative to how societies change.
The history of racism in the United States runs 400 years.
Right.
You might start the clock then, although you could start it earlier because the institution didn't come from us. But yeah.
Right. My point is that, and I mean, that number of things change. I mean, the difference between, what was the first number? 24%?
Yeah.
And pushing 50%?
Yes.
I mean, that's a big swing.
It is a big swing.
Right. And
it's a big swing that's the result of very large demonstrations, right? And
right. Yeah.
And frankly, and we don't know what it's the result of, but it certainly is the result of more people. This is always wrong to say certainly. I'm certain of it. But it is very likely that television exposure, right, is a big part. That's sort of what shapes the national conversation. And television exposure, we know where that came from. I mean, we know what the issues were.
But I guess my point is that the only thing I think that I agree with that statement. I agree with the systemic racism thing. And I also agree that protests have made a huge difference, and exposing the issue have made a huge difference with this issue. What I want to push back against is the idea that that there is a issue that we aren't in a position to fix with our country with regards to racism, where I think that we don't need to restart. I'm not like, I don't think that there's something fundamentally wrong with our society that that demonstrations of the sort that people are doing, and honest participation in the marketplace of ideas can't fix moving forward. And I think you can see the power of that, especially now as people are able to get exposed to more and more information about how the world actually is more quickly with all these with social media and smartphones. I think things can change for the better quickly.
Look at Arab Spring, to your point. Look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, even earlier, way back earlier, before social media was quite, right? I don't know if you remember, or if you had a chance to study. I know you don't remember. You were way too young. The Berlin Wall fell, but I can tell you it happened fast, right?
Yeah.
It seemed like it happened fast, incredibly fast. And it wasn't accelerated by social media because there weren't any. There was a big media play, no question, but it was it was different than, say, the Arab Spring, in which the whole world was on Twitter, and yeah. So you're right. Social change can happen fast, but it's interesting. We could go down some of those roads. Look, take your favorite social change that's happened fast and ask yourself how much really changed. That's also a fair question, and it maybe is a rabbit hole, because it's the sort of thing where you can just smuggle in a gloom and doom perspective, and you could never be wrong about it because it's so vague. How much has really changed, right?
Yeah.
But I do think you've got to be, you certainly have to look past the changes of the hour. I mean, Arab Spring resulted in all kinds of wonderful demonstrations and put back. I actually was in Bahrain twice before Arab Spring, and I heard the foreign minister, with whom I'd been in roughly the same. I'd been in a meeting hosted by him twice, actually, and beforehand, and I learned there, for example, that education among women had gone back 90 years in Bahrain, and they were hosting a world conference on education, and they were really thinking out of the box, and they were very progressive. And then Arab Spring came, and then regime cracked down in Bahrain. And the very last words I heard out of his mouth, this foreign minister's mouth, were, "We almost lost our soul as a nation," he's saying, in describing the response that the regime took against protesters. And now you don't hear anything out of Bahrain. Now, maybe I followed less, and that might be true, but my impression is that hardline just took over. And you might say, gosh, look at all that progress, but take another look and see what's actually changed, and the answer is maybe nothing. So you can do something similar to that here. And you can apply that same question, that same sort of skeptical lens. It's a questioning lens. I don't mean it to be not undefeatable, but we still had 4 Minneapolis police officers kneeling. They weren't all kneeling. That's wrong. More than one of them were kneeling, right?
Yeah.
Some of them, at least 3 minutes after one of them said, "We can't get a pulse on this guy. Don't you think we should roll him over onto his side?" And the answer was no, and nobody ever did. Right. And which is, that's sort of the basis for the stirrings for first degree murder charge, that perhaps in that very moment you see reflection and an intent to do lethal harm. But in any case, that happened on the streets of Minneapolis. And those guys they're regular guys, just like the police in our city. They might very well be. This isn't the deep South. This isn't some antiquarian throwback where civil rights never got brought into play. This is freaking Minnesota. Although some people, I've heard somebody call it, it's kind of like Mississippi only with snow. But I don't know if that's a fair charge in terms of the racial attitudes there. But that happened right in the city streets, and people protested, said, "Hey, what are you doing? Go easy on this guy," whatever it was they were saying. And the police response was to get up and stand in the way so that those protesters didn't come any closer, right? And they still killed them in broad daylight. That is a fair description. It's by no means the only description, but it's certainly a description which many people would be sympathetic with for what happened there. And that's after Ferguson. That's after this 24 to 48% change in people's attitudes. So you might say, boy, the changes that need to happen are deeply, deeply entrenched. And people's opinions demonstrated in opinion polls, if that's all that changes, that's not enough. That's not real change.
I do think there's a lot of other things to talk about here in response to that, but I think at least comparing these two statistics can be pretty misleading, because asking if people think that African Americans are treated unfairly by the police is not the same as asking about should gay people be allowed to have relationships or should they allowed to get married. Something more similar would be, do you think like it's right for the police to treat African Americans more harshly? And I think you could get a much different response to that one.
That's a very good point, John. That's right.
So, I mean, there's still a lot of other points in that conversation, but.
Right. No, that's a good one. And I take it you're implying that there are precious few people who would argue that they ought to be treated differently.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a good question. How long has that been the case? And where? Yeah. My guess is that's probably been the case since the civil rights movement really made a very big difference in the United States. There'd be far fewer people who thought that a different standard ought to be applied.
And that, yeah, I mean, also that question does, I mean, especially in the last couple of years, it does directly play into a larger political discussion and culture war and that type of thing. So I think conservatives would be less likely to answer that question in the affirmative.
Yeah. I don't know if that's because they're conservatives or because they don't know, they don't have firsthand experience with the ordinary experience of African Americans in the United States. My guess is fewer conservatives do have that experience than people who would not consider themselves conservatives.
Yeah.
Right? Part of that is because
I mean, that certainly could be another reason, but I think it does. A question like that does kind of play into the culture war a little bit.
That's a good point.
And then people just take sides based on.
That's good.
Whatever their perspective is. But yeah, there was a lot of other things there. So,
I mean, I think there's some real changes that it seems like should be made with regards to how powerful the police union is, how easy it is for bad cops to be able to be rehired at other places. I mean, this dude had 18 citations for. I mean, how on earth was this dude still a police officer? I mean,
yeah, actually,
stuff like that it's insane. I mean, and then the guy who shot Tamir Rice, isn't that the kid's, the 12-year-old's name, who was killed in the park, right? The dude who shot him had a bunch of citations. I mean, it's like there's a real issue there with the ability for cops to get relocated different places.
Yeah. I was thinking of this earlier, but I listened to a podcast today. It was by The Daily, the New York Times podcast. And it literally answers that question, John, which is, the podcast is called The System That Protects Police. And it's 20 minutes, and it goes down through a list of 5 things about all the reasons that police officers are not getting penalized, bad police officers are getting rehired other places. And also, to tie that into an earlier discussion, I think this system in particular that does allow this could be like the uniquely rotten aspect of policing or of the police force.
Is this, how much of that system is just an application of union protection, politics, et cetera, to policing, and how much of it is something other than that?
I did write down the 5. I can list them off real quick.
Sure. Thanks.
So big one. The first one is they police themselves, basically. The investigative service. It's kind of similar to like an HR department, which is, the HR department is not about protecting you, it's about protecting the company. And I think that same thing applies to how they police themselves to some extent. Police are entitled to a certain type of civil service protections that goes out to all civil servants. And the way this system works, I think this number 2 is actually a big one, is that anytime they ever get fired, they can basically, because they're civil servants, they can appeal through this. And one of the ways in which the system is super broken is they have this pretty messed up system of precedent where all you have to do is say, like, there was this case in the past where a cop kicked a protester and he didn't get fired. And so I got fired, but they didn't make this decision last time. So, and then that can sometimes work, and they can get reinstated. There are some civilian review boards, but they're mainly toothless. Basically, they can't really affect meaningful change. And then, yeah, police unions are the other huge point from what I can tell. I think this example in Minneapolis illustrates it pretty well, where historically they've said Minneapolis is like really backwards and bad at policing. And it's because they have a police union there, and the leader of the police union there is really anti-reformist. And I think he already went on record saying he's going to try and get the 4 officers reinstated who were involved in this. So that could just give you an indication of the type of police union and the type of things they're doing. And then the final thing is police are really protected by, like if it ever goes to a court, they can claim reasonable fear, which is basically if they ever did anything inappropriate or shot someone or beat someone, they could say, I feared for myself or another officer's life. And it's really hard to like say, I disagree with you completely. So yeah, those are the 5 main reasons they illustrate in the podcast for why.
And that's what qualified immunity is, correct? That's the reasonable fear.
I'm not
element.
Yeah, and so they're really hard to fire, and that encourages and allows really bad attitudes and a bad work environment to fester, I think. So
that's helpful. Thanks for rehearsing those. I asked the question, how many of those depended on the union, and the union only showed up in one of them, but it is possible also that a strong union might be present in all of them, because strong unions can shape policies, they can even shape laws.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and it is a fair question to ask. I mean, I'm sure there's good reasons for all these things to be in place. I mean, police officers have a really difficult job that they're interacting with people who really hate them every day, so they need some strong protections. But yeah, I think it's created a system that is not effective at retaining good police officers, or it's not effective at getting rid of bad police officers at the very least.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot here. We touched on reparations and economic, deep economic roots of injustice, and that question whether there are such roots, whether they still exist, what influence they have, what we do about them, et cetera. We only touched on that. But I think another whole area that we didn't really touch on, except in a word, is the whole notion of incarceration, right? Because we have, and everything that goes with, so it's not just incarceration, it's the whole legal system. When you come out, you're a felon, for example. I mean, if you're convicted for felony, and now all kinds of things follow you forever, right? So we basically send you in a place where other people with no futures, so to say, I'm putting this too quickly, but we lock you up with a lot of other people who don't have very much of a future either, because of the laws that we put in place, right? And then what? And then you come back out to permanent disenfranchisement. I mean that literally and figuratively, right? Not literally, you can't vote, which is what I think the primary meaning of that term is, but there's a lot more you can't do. You're out.
Yeah.
And that's a unbelievably disproportionately high tool, right, to contain African American behavior, to regulate African American behavior. I mean, I think I'm describing that in a neutral way. Not that everybody would like it, but I don't see how anybody can object to it. It is a tool for regulating behavior, and it does in fact regulate African American behavior at a far higher rate than, certainly a far higher rate than is proportionate to their place in the population.
Do other nations have the concept of felonies and having to inform your employer, or the employer being able to know ahead of time?
I'm not an expert, but I believe the answer is yes, and I believe that's because we brought our system from English common law, and or from English law, and I think that distinction goes, the distinction of whether or not you're a felon, run back prior to the founding, prior to our breaking away and starting our own legal system. So that would be
Yeah,
one.
because it's one of those things where you can like absolutely recognize the problems with it, but I mean, if someone commits a serious crime, does it wipe from their record, or like what's the alternative?
Right, that's a good question. Why not enable someone to expunge it from their record? Why not have a cleaning system?
Yeah. Seems like the way it ought to be.
Yeah, I don't know. That's another good question. I just mean these things are connected.
Yeah, I mean, I could if a family member got murdered, I'd be pretty pissed if there was something that the murderer could do to clean their record. I mean, maybe that's a more extreme case than most of the stuff, but I mean, for drugs and nonviolent crime, absolutely. But
yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I think about it. These are good questions. So there's a lot. It'd be great to do a concept map of this whole thing.
Yeah.
It'd take a long time to lay it all out. But
yeah.
As a matter of fact, maybe I'll give it a try. I used to use what's it called, Mind Mapper. It was a little Google add-on, but I think that's concept map is very helpful. Just a nice place to hang stuff and connect it up and just think about it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we could, so also an easy way to start that is a word map, and it'd be fun. That would be something we could actually do with a transcript of this call, for example. Although that doesn't quite capture it, because sometimes you focused on some things when you're relevant focusing on something else. And a concept map could show you that. All right, we said we're going to hang with 90 minutes, and we're past that already. So.
Oh man! Wow.
Time flies when you're having fun, in a way.
Yeah.
Fun is this series for fun, but it is engaging and it is important.
Yeah.
So JP, I'm going to go home and I'm going to think long and hard. I am home actually, but I'm going to go. I'm going to take the conversation offline, and I'm going to think hard about how to express, how to capture, how to express, how to put into practice the kind of optimism for reform, which I really admired in your push back, right, against the suggestion that maybe our system is maybe you were pushing back behind the lines, really going back into if we were founded wrongly in some ways, right? Maybe we've always had this problem, and maybe there are deep infrastructure changes that need to be made, and without making those, maybe we're hitting our heads against the wall, expecting fundamental changes. That would be the more pessimistic, deep analysis of the problem, sort of thing. But I don't know if you're pushing back at that or not, actually. But I certainly recognized your take on the real change that's taking place, and seeing that real change as a sign of a hopeful sign.
Yeah. I mean, I am hopeful. I mean, whether that could be naive, but I don't. It seems to me it's either be hopeful or we have something it seems to me it's either be hopeful or we need another revolution. In that.
Well, I mean, it
So-
seems to me you have to be hopeful either way. I mean, what's the point in revolution if you don't have any hope for change?
Well, yeah, I mean, be hopeful in the capacity of our system to change itself.
Yes, right. For us to change inside the system, be hopeful about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hopeful about that too. Very much so. I don't see that we can't change our system from inside it, but I do think we need to look at we need to have a good analysis of the challenges to that system faces.
Yeah.
In order to change it. If you don't have your hand on the root, you're not going to uproot it.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I do think actually it kind of relates to this conversation with maybe a more pessimistic perspective, but with the difficulty in firing police officers, there were sometimes some really like hopeful, they were voted in police chiefs that were trying to change the system. They were known as reformers and they're going to change it. But the police unions were so powerful that they could actually, the police chief would fire someone and then they could be forced to rehire them by the union.
Mm-hmm.
So the system is so entrenched that even the reformers couldn't make a change. But
yeah. Yeah. Well, schools have a similar story. Sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. Probably everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere there's power. Okay. Well, let's peel out for now. Let's come back together on Friday. I sent around a copy of a paper. Did you both get it?
Yeah. Non-moral goodness.
Yeah. It's a title.
Did you just send it to our email?
I did.
Okay. I probably have it. I just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's from Doc Hub. It may not be from me. It may be from Doc Hub in the. I forget. I shared it out of Doc Hub.
Yep.
Okay,
yeah.
good. All right. Good. Well, we'll take a look at it, and I can tell you this: that paper sort of sets up some things, and I read it to see if I could cut it down actually for purposes of our discussion. I just reread it. I think it is actually useful to read the whole thing, and I think it goes fairly fast. But yeah, I think that's true. But there's a longer section to it. There's very plainly there's a reconciliation section. You'll recognize it very quickly just skimming it. It's sort of, here's some different approaches. Here's some features of those approaches, and they look fragmented. These approaches look like they take in different directions, but they don't have to. You can interweave them. It's that section of the paper that I think might be worth the most our discussing. And then there's a little bit of revisiting those fragmented pieces in light of the reconciliation that you can leave off too, actually, and just sort of read that reconciliation. But I don't think it will make as much sense. The point is that reconciliation, but it doesn't make as much sense without at least skimming the foundations.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. See you on Friday.
Friday, if not before.
See ya.